So I just want to welcome everybody who is here. We'll probably get a few more folks, I guess, coming in a bit late, but welcome everybody who's here to our panel on the US left and labor after Trump. We have three excellent panelists today, three of my favorite commentators and thinkers on the US political situation are here. So that's really a treat for us this afternoon. Before I begin, I just want to mention that the Socialist Project has recently published a pamphlet on the Sanders moment and after, which Raphael Kachaturian and I edited. I'm just going to introduce the topic quickly and frame today's panel. And the comments I'm going to make are drawn from the introductory essay that I wrote with Raphael in that pamphlet. So it seems to me that the key strategic dilemma that the left is facing today is this tension between the legitimacy crisis of neoliberalism on the one hand, and the stranglehold of the two corporate parties over electoral politics on the other. Neoliberalism may be widely discredited, but there are yet no signs of splits or crises within the ruling class that could create a revolutionary break or even a meaningful break from the basic neoliberal orientation of the American political economy today. Similarly, there's no political forces on the scene today, either left or right, that seem capable of affecting a break with neoliberalism either, as the outcome of the Trump presidency has today made clear. So the question for the left today is really how to take the generalized discontent with neoliberalism and turn it into the basis for a struggle on the terrain of the state to break with neoliberalism and ultimately to transform and democratize the capitalist state. Moreover, how can the left do so in a way that gets beyond the limited politics of street protest on the one hand and the impasse of social democratic politics, as Leo Panitch called it in a classic Socialist Register essay, on the other? Bernie Sanders obviously seemed to offer a way toward building a mass socialist party through a dirty break, but his defeat has complicated this. Now, for those who don't know, the dirty break is a strategy that's been put forward by some significant parts of the Democratic Socialists of America, whereby by running political candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line from the federal level on down to the state and municipal level, the infrastructure can be created through those campaigns to create a new party that would break away from the Democratic Party at some time in the future. The failure of Sanders, however, to win the Democratic nomination suggested that a much more substantial base needs to be built, not just to win the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, but even more to implement a transformative agenda, even if this were to be achieved. Moreover, those advocating a dirty break have not always clearly laid out a strategy for when and how this break can actually occur, which has led to calls today in the wake of Sanders' defeat to immediately break with the Democrats, or else has also, on the other hand, led to the risk that these efforts to create a left, to create the basis for a dirty break will simply result in the creation of a new progressive caucus within the Democratic Party's kind of institutional ecosystem. Moreover, there's been oftentimes a failure to elaborate clearly how the social democratic reforms that can be won through this process of running people as Democrats can actually build toward a break with capitalism. In other words, going from winning universal health care to actually democratizing the state and the economic system in a much more profound and deep way, such that it's oriented around meeting human needs rather than private profit. On the other hand, the main critics of the dual power of the dirty break theory have been dual power strategists, and they have not yet, or they have not elaborated a clear path to organizing the forces necessary for a socialist break. They tend to encourage street mobilization and militant protest, but they have not elaborated a strategy whereby this can go beyond simply the examples that we've already seen of that, and actually lead to a lasting kind of socialist infrastructure that can implement something like a revolutionary change from capitalism to socialism. However, this approach seemed to get a boost in the wake of Sanders' defeat and the explosion of the Black Lives Matter protests that followed. But while encouraging in their militancy and the depth of support that they attracted, these protests have now faded from the scene by and large and have left little behind in terms of the political infrastructure for left politics. So now that Biden has been elected, and the dual insurgencies from both Sanders and Trump momentarily quelled, the question that's put before our panelists today is, what is the way forward for the left? Biden won primarily based on hatred of Trump and not because he actually offered a path toward addressing the sufferings imparted by 4 decades of neoliberal devastation. And in fact, he's somewhat likely to return to those very neoliberal policies that generated the rise of the right and Trumpism over the course of his administration. Either way, presumably the underlying political crisis of legitimacy of the capitalist system, but also neoliberalism in particular, will not be going away, nor will the rage that culminated in the election of Donald Trump simply disappear. So given that, what space will there be for the left to build under a Biden administration? And what strategy should the left pursue to translate this widespread discontent with neoliberalism into a political force that's actually capable of charting a course out of neoliberalism and breaking the two-party deadlock, rather than leaving this to the far right, to fuel the far right, which may yet return in an even worse form than what we've seen under Trump? To answer these questions, we have 3 wonderful panelists today, 3 people who I respect immensely and am very eager to hear their presentations and their thoughts on these and other questions. First, we have Chris Maisano, who's a contributing editor at Jacobin magazine and a member of the Catalyst editorial board, as well as a union staffer in New York. He is a long-standing member of the Democratic Socialists of America as well. We also have Jonathan Rosenblum, who's a Seattle-based union and community organizer and the author of Beyond $15, Immigrant Workers, Faith Activists, and the Revival of the Labor Movement, which was published in 2017. It's an excellent book, and I recommend that everybody who hasn't already take a look at that. He works as a community organizer for Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant, and served as a strategic advisor to Cope and Jean Swanson in her successful Vancouver City Council campaign 2 years ago. He added to his bio that he dreams of being a Canadian someday, minus, of course, the infatuation with hockey fights. Nicole Aschoff, finally, is on the editorial board at Jacobin. She is the author of The Smartphone Society, Technology, Power, and Resistance in the New Gilded Age, as well as previously the book, The New Prophets of Capital. So each of these speakers will speak for around 20 minutes, and then we will follow with a question and answer period. Okay, so with that, I turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank Socialist Project for asking me, inviting me to come and speak here. Happy to see some people that I know and miss and wish I could see in person and haven't seen in a long time. And I'm happy to spend part of my day today talking to all of you about some very important political and strategic questions that we're facing here in the United States, but I think have a broader relevance to socialist activists and organizers in Canada and in other parts of the world as well. I will note that I myself am also a very big hockey fan, lifelong New York Rangers fan. Sorry to all the Leafs fans who may be on this call. Jonathan, you'll know that the game is moving away from goonery and fights and towards more speed and skill. So now is your time to get into NHL hockey. And I think a team is coming to Seattle too. So there you go. Oh, we're Habs fans here. Okay. Don't even get me started on the Habs. All right. But I'm just going to put that aside for now. We'll address that in the Q&A. Okay. So let me just actually get into my talk instead of talking about hockey, even though I would love to talk more about that and I miss it a lot. The title and the prompts for this event are forward-looking. They ask us to consider the challenges and the tasks that are facing us here on the American left as we move from Trump to Biden and all that entails. But I do think it's worth spending a few minutes to take some stock of the rise of the new Democratic Socialist left in the US, why it's grown, and what that means for both American politics in general and for socialist strategy in this country. So I think the main story for the socialist left over the past few years has to be DSA's growth and transformation since 2016. During that time, we've gone from 6,000 to about 85,000 members across the country. In addition to that just kind of numerical quantitative growth, there's been a big change in the nature of why people join. We've gone basically from having a large number of paper members who weren't particularly active in the life of the organization to a much larger active base of participants and organizers that are building their chapters and building movements around the country. Some of the bigger accomplishments of DSA and kind of the movements that we're a part of, I think are quite well known, but there are also some other victories and some other successes that we've had that have gone more under the radar that I can, be happy to share more information about with people here, either in the Q&A or afterwards via email or what have you. I think we all have a sense of why there's been such an explosion in the ranks of organized socialists and socialism in the US. There's the rampant inequality, the deep dysfunction of the political system, and the just total rottenness of the American ruling class, racism, police violence, mass incarceration, xenophobia, impending ecological chaos, all the rest of it. Specific progressive policies, of the type that Bernie Sanders and others have called for, they've long been popular in the US. But socialism as a political project, or the idea of political revolution, what Sanders talked about in both of his campaigns, has not been in quite some time. But that's changed. Now, I think the key to cohering and institutionalizing the widespread social ferment in the US was absolutely the two Bernie Sanders campaigns, 2016 and 2020. I don't think that we'd have a growing socialist movement in the US without his campaigns. I won't run down everything of what he accomplished here. I think we're probably pretty well familiar with what those campaigns entailed, although we can talk about them more in the Q&A. Coming out of the two Sanders campaigns, the political events of the last 4 years, the results of the most recent election, and just kind of the general experience that we on the socialist left have had here in the US over the past few years, I think we can come to three main political or strategic conclusions, at least from my point of view. The first one is that the road to class formation, or maybe perhaps more specifically class reformation, in the US will run largely, although certainly not exclusively, through the arena of electoral politics. The second one is that I think the Democratic Party question is settled, at least for the time being. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about what I mean by that. And third, I think it's pretty clear at this point that the only viable political strategic orientation for socialists in a country like the US is what Ralph Miliband called Marxist or left reformism. And I'll get into more details on that as well. So let's come back to the first point. This question of class formation and electoral politics. Here in the US, and I think in Canada and many other countries as well, election campaigns, and here in the US, it's presidential elections above all, they're the form of political activity that ordinary people engage with the most. In a formal, partial democracy like the US, elections are typically perceived as synonymous with politics itself. Even though the level of popular enthusiasm for politics in this sense is usually not very high, and people here in the US, if you talk to the average person, they will tell you how much they hate politics. Even though their level of enthusiasm is not particularly high, any political project of the left aspiring to mass support really does need to have something of an ongoing electoral expression if it wants to be successful and become a reference point for popular struggles outside the electoral arena. I think this has long been the case in advanced capitalist countries with representative government and universal suffrage. But the salience of electoral politics and democratic socialist strategy, I'd argue, has only increased as the size and the strength of mass membership organizations generally, and labor unions in particular, has declined. The decline of organized labor, coupled with the widespread disintegration of urban working class community life, means that only a relatively small minority of the working class here in the US is currently situated to engage in effective forms of collective action at work or in their communities. Consequently, there are few channels available outside of election campaigns to engage and politicize a mass audience on a regular basis. And the ones that are potentially available are typically defensive in nature and limited to radical expressions of what you might call interest group pressure politics. In this context, I think electoral activity and public policy are going to have to play a very important role in reconstituting the working class as a political subject in this country, and in creating a more favorable environment for workers to organize and engage in class struggle outside of the electoral arena. Here in New York, we've recently had the good fortune of electing I think something like 5 of our members to the state legislature here where I live in central Brooklyn, in my district, where the assembly and Senate districts overlapped. We elected the senator and the assembly person from both from this area. Our hope is that we can use their offices to both do, very effective constituent services for people, and then also organize something of a kind of an ongoing base of political activists and organizers here in the district. So just to give people a sense of what concretely I mean by that, and I hope we can accomplish by that, that's kind of what I have in mind. The second point, the Democratic Party question. My own personal view on this at this point is that the Democratic Party question is settled, at least for now. I think whether we like it or not, activists here in the US are going to use the primary system as long as it exists and it bears fruit. Traditional party machines, as we've known them here in the US, are almost entirely moribund. They're hollowed out. They can't effectively defend themselves, and they can't effectively oppose insurgents, take for example, AOC, once they win office. I do still want us to think about and strategize for and organize for the emergence of a new mass kind of working class, labor, socialist party of some kind. But I do think that any viable path to a transformation of the party system and a new party of the left or of the working class is going to have to run through conflict first in the Democratic Party. At this point in time, US politics is nationalized and it's polarized, and the space for local and state level independent parties, which is, I think, how you would traditionally in this country go about trying to build a new party of the left or of the working class, has been closed off. So I think that the path both for building power for the socialist left here in the US in the shorter term, and then also building the groundwork for a transformation of the party system in the longer term, is through maximum contestation of primaries to knock out as many incumbents and establishment figures as possible. And then also, this is potentially going to be a lot harder to pull off, some kind of electoral college reform or abolition. I think that the goal here needs to be, in order to get us to the point where something like a new party, at least at a national level, is possible, is to give establishment figures in both of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans alike, an incentive to support electoral reforms that open space for viable new parties. I was really hoping that, not because I love the guy or thought that anything good would come out of it necessarily, but I was really hoping that Joe Biden would run the table in Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, all these southern electoral vote-rich states that the Republicans have typically dominated. Because I think if they had come to see that they wouldn't be able to just bank on those votes indefinitely into the future, they would have had a very new incentive to support at least some kind of reform of the Electoral College, if not its outright abolition. And I think that we're probably not going to see a path to any kind of new parties until we can kind of defuse the nationalization and polarization of American politics, until the Electoral College is either gone or radically reformed. And then my third point, I think at this point, the only viable strategic political orientation for socialists in a country like the US is what Ralph Miliband called Marxist or left reformism. The proof of this, I think, is that DSA has succeeded while all the other socialist currents have stagnated or collapsed. Whether that goes for the socialism from below or international socialist tradition, as it's also known, or the newer, what's often known as the base building tendency here in the US. I think both of those traditions are, limited by their basic kind of anti-electoralism, as well as what tends to be their dogmatic sectarianism on the Democratic Party question. I personally don't see, either of those two traditions or any other of the conceivable competitor traditions on the left in the United States really bearing much fruit. I think that the path that we have tried to follow here in the US through DSA and other organizations is really the only thing that's available to us. In that sense, I really agree with what Miliband argued in his final book, Socialism for a Skeptical Age, where he concluded that, and this is a quote from the book, the best that the left hope for in the relevant future in advanced capitalist countries is the strengthening of left reformism as a current of thought and policy in social democratic parties. And that's the end of the quote. I think both the emergence of Sanders here in the US and Corbyn in the UK bore this forecast out, but their defeats electorally, at least, also point to the very strong headwinds that the new left faces here in North America and the UK and elsewhere. Just because this is the only road available to us doesn't mean it's going to be straight ahead or evenly paved. So let's turn now from kind of a backwards facing view to more of a forward facing view. Let's turn to the challenges ahead. As I see it, I think there are three main challenges for US labor and the American left in the coming years. I think the first is our sectoral and geographic concentration. The second is the fact that our political system is structurally biased against the places where labor and the left are strongest. And the third is the, I think, dire need that we have to build or rebuild what I'm calling social and spatial alliances. So first, let's talk about this point about sectoral and geographic concentration. One of the most striking things about American politics, I think, is how closely the structure of political conflict maps onto patterns of economic geography. Last month, some of you may have seen this, the Brookings Institution, very mainstream, but sometimes they put out some interesting stuff, released a study showing how Biden voting counties accounted for 70% of the country's economic output, while Trump voting counties accounted for the rest, the remaining 30%. Democratic voting areas tend to be large, dense, and metropolitan, while Republican voting areas tend to be small town, exurban, or rural. The economic and social composition of these areas are very different. And here in the US, these differences are often translated politically into the language of culture war, which is extremely productive for any kind of socialist or class-based left. With the decline of industrial unionism here in the US, what remains of organized labor also tends to be concentrated in the more urbanized metropolitan areas of the more urbanized and metropolitan states. I think we all know the pockets of strength: education, healthcare, government employment, and some areas of private sector service employment. Take building services in cities and metropolitan areas, for example. The sectoral concentration is related to, and it's compounded by, the geographic concentration. They tend to work together. And an often overlooked fact about the US labor movement is that a majority of union members live in just 7 states. And those are California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, and Washington. Active DSA chapters and any kind of representation of the organized left in general, or social movement organizations, also tend to be concentrated in the same geographic areas and the same kinds of social movement. While I think DSA members can often be too hard on ourselves regarding our class and social composition, I think there's no doubt that we also tend to draw on people employed in these sorts of professional or sub-professional settings. Although in this, we're not unique. I think the same is true of most left-wing parties and movements that we see in the world today. That's not a fatal flaw, but I think it does pose some very important and significant political and strategic dilemmas that we have to grapple with and start to move towards resolving. The second challenge or issue that I want to point to is our structurally biased political system. The structure of political representation in the US, it systematically underrepresents precisely those areas where labor and the left are strongest, the areas that I was just talking about above. This means that labor struggles to win reforms at the federal level where they're most needed, because the federal level is where private sector labor law is decided and promulgated. It also means that while we on the left can win elections and build some strength in cities and inner ring suburbs, and here in New York, a place like Lower Westchester County comes to mind as a prime example, we may find it difficult to break out beyond these areas. If we can't build power in suburban and rural areas, we're going to remain a distinct minority in legislative bodies, and we're not going to be able to win statewide elections. Now, these structural biases of the political system here in the US tend to work to the benefit of the right, and they know it. That's why they always defend the counter-majoritarian and undemocratic aspects of the system. And it's why they're going to probably become increasingly anti-democratic in the years to come. They have an incentive to lock things down in place while they can, which means that they have an incentive to double down on their racism, their xenophobia, and their kind of general contempt for popular rule. So the challenge for us in this regard is to wage a battle for democratic political reform without making it seem like a battle for capital D democratic partisan advantage. Which brings me to my last point. And that last point is the crying need that we have, I think, for social and spatial or geographic alliances. we've got to figure out how to continue building in our existing areas of strength while not remaining captive to them. To do this, we need to establish social and spatial alliances that will hopefully allow us to broaden out our appeal and prevent us from being trapped within the current structure of urban, rural, college-educated, non-college educated, and racialized types of conflicts that we find a lot in American politics. Now, I think the basic, in thinking about these things, I'm trying to revisit some of our history as a movement, as a global movement. The basic strategic premise of, I think, all successful 20th century socialist movements, from Russian Bolshevism to Scandinavian social democracy to Maoism, and even to American socialism, where and when it was strong, was the worker-peasant or the worker-farmer alliance. Now, we don't really have peasants anymore here in the US, but we need to figure out how to recreate our version of this kind of social, spatial, political coalition today that's consistent with the class structure we have in this country, which was consistent with the patterns of economic geography we find in this country, if we're going to continue making further advances. How are we going to do that? I don't have any definitive answers for any of those questions yet, but I do have some ideas. Let me just run through a few of them very briefly. The first is what, for lack of a better phrase, I'm going to just call strategic carpetbagging. I think that some of us citified socialists should seriously consider moving to and rooting themselves in places where the left is basically non-existent, but the social and economic conditions and trends offer something to work with. This can include small town and rural places within states like New York or California. It could be regions where the left has historically been weak, like the Southwest or the Deep South. There's absolutely no guarantee of success here, but I do think that the career of someone like a Bernie Sanders shows how something like this might be possible. Before the 70s, before a lot of hippies and people from the city, New York City and other places really started moving up to Vermont, Vermont was a very, very conservative state. And it is in some pockets, but the politics there.
It's just your 2-minute warning has sounded, just so you know.
Thank you, Steve. I'm just about to wrap up.
Okay.
The second is what we might call a rank and file or salting strategy regarding the labor movement. Socialists with the interest and ability to do so should do what they can to build workplace organization in the places where it's needed the most and where the potential overlap with political action is most promising. There are many settings that come to mind, but perhaps the most important is logistics and warehouse work. It's both economically strategic and it tends to be concentrated in exurban and rural areas. Think of northeastern Pennsylvania or the big logistics hubs of the Mid-South, for example. Companies like Amazon have endless resources to combat worker organization, of course, but if there's going to be a new breakthrough in labor, for labor in this country, then this is where it's going to have to be made. Next, I would say we have to invest a lot in popular media. It's a huge and socially atomized country here in the US. Whether we like it or not, one of the most effective ways we have to reach people beyond our current ranks is media. We tend to laugh at the idea of socialists hawking newspapers today, but Lenin was really onto something when he highlighted the importance of media in his day newspapers in organizing a huge country like Russia. Today, the right is much better at this than we are. And of course, one major reason for that is they have a lot more money and producing quality media costs money. But if we're going to reach people we can now, we need a whole lot more of it. And that doesn't mean just more podcasts or magazines. I think above all else, we desperately need more video in every format possible. Then the final point I'll make without really getting into too much detail is really coming back to something I said before, which is highlighting democratic with a small d demands. I think there's a huge appetite in the country for this kind of program. I think more and more people are seeing the connection between kind of their daily social miseries and the fact that the political system is just utterly rotten. Those trends in kind of the structural biases and the non-representativeness of the political system are just going to continue becoming worse and worse and more visible in this country in the years ahead. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was excellent. Now we're going to move on to Jonathan Rosenblum.
Great. Thanks very much, and it's really great to see everybody on the Zoom. Wish we could do this in person. Thanks to the Socialist Project for putting this on and hosting it, and Chris, those were really very good framing remarks. I may get a little bit more granular in terms of movement stuff, but I thought that was a fabulous overview. When I was preparing for today, I asked my wife, who's a rank and file union member, works for the federal government, what I should say. I said, what should I tell our Canadian friends? And she said, well, you should tell them the truth. We're fucked and you're next. And while there's a certain truth to that, it really doesn't leave me much to say for the remaining 14 minutes of my time. And I imagine you're probably a bit more interested in some nuanced analysis. So while the truth is that we appear, at least for now, to have dodged a fascist bullet, and while it's grounds for some celebration, it's not a time for any victory laps here. I just note that the title for this conversation speaks about being after, the left after Trump, and I'm not sure we're after Trump in any way. We all know that Biden is going to bring a full-throated pro-corporate agenda into the White House, and if anyone who we work with has any illusions about that, about which side of the class fence he's on, I think I'd point them to the stock market's performance since November 3rd, because the stock market knows exactly who Biden is going to be serving. The question for the next few years, at least for me, is less about breakthrough wins at the national level concretely, because the balance of power right now doesn't suggest that we're close to breaking through on Medicare for all, racial justice, housing justice, or industrial policy on a national basis in the immediate future. Rather, what can be done in the next 4 years with this breathing space is to build grassroots movements, practice more militant tactics, do the socialist base building that we need to do, and set ourselves up for bigger national gains down the road. And a big part of this is engaging in local fights where we can win. And I would just note that in the last cycle, the election cycle, we did win a lot of fights on the local level, whether it was childcare, minimum wage increase in Florida, for instance, police accountability measures that passed in a number of cities. So what I want to focus on for my time is to talk about how movements assess or often misassess power, and draw on some recent experiences, and then identify some of the more promising sites of struggle for 2021 and beyond. And I'm also interested, of course, in hearing from you how your experiences, wherever you are, inform your outlook in the coming years, because we have to learn from one another. One of the most important contributions that we can make on both sides of the border in the immediate period ahead is to win movement activists who might not be socialists right now over to a much clearer understanding of power and class. And we'll do that within struggles. Consciousness gets developed when we're in motion together with others. In any fight, whether it's the workplace, the community, or the halls of political power, we're not going to build an effective movement if there isn't a clear and common understanding of who the enemy is. And right now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's quite murky on the left, whether you're looking at the union movement or the fight against police violence or the electoral majority that defeated Trump. For example, many people in the resistance, what they called the resistance in the last 4 years, defines the enemy as Trump. Or if they had a bit more depth of analysis, they would say the enemy was Trumpism, the far-right activist base that's grown in size and confidence in the last 4 years. And of course, they're not wrong, but it's a very incomplete picture. The problem is not so much Trump as it is the long-term forces of late-stage capitalism at work, producing the kind of staggering inequality and alienation that Chris has mentioned and that we are all familiar with. This new Gilded Age that we're in is characterized by unchecked corporate power, state and local governments that are completely subservient to the corporate agenda, including democratic governments, backed up by militarized and unbridled police forces. And just as an example, I think you're very familiar with one man in my hometown of Seattle, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. Today is worth $185 billion, and that's up from around $115 billion in just the 9 months since the pandemic struck. He has made more money in the last 9 months during the pandemic than he has made at any other time in his history. Now, to Democrats and liberals, including many union and organizational leaders whom we work with daily, this mind-boggling greed provokes the rally cry that the system is broken, so we have to elect Biden and Democratic majorities in Congress. And of course, to us socialists, these facts show that the system is working exactly as it was intended to, and it's not going to fundamentally change with Democrats in power. A couple of weeks ago, the editor of a small liberal American journal invited me and a bunch of other activists to submit short essays addressing what we thought the Biden administration should do in the next 4 years. And it certainly is fair enough to assemble these ideas. But for many on the left, there's a presumption behind the question, which I would completely reject, that Biden actually gives a shit about what we have to think or say. He doesn't, except of course, if he's doing opposition research. Delusions develop when political discourse and struggle are ungrounded in an analysis of power and class. And the extent of delusionary thinking today in the movement in America is really a reflection of how much work we as socialists, as union activists, as people in the struggle have yet to do. And I want to give you a wider example. Chris talked about the defunding the fight to defund the police. And we all had very heady moments in so many cities around the continent back in June, when millions of people were marching in the streets demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to racist policing. It felt, at least in this city, that the country had perhaps finally reached a turning point in the continuing conflict that was never truly resolved in this country after the Civil War. That is, the fight over slavery and more generally, the essential role of racism in undergirding capitalism. The origination point, as you probably know, in the struggle, Minneapolis, the movement compelled the local city council to declare they were going to defund and dismantle the police force. In Seattle, it was exhilarating to see tens of thousands of people, very diverse crowds, marching downtown, marching in the neighborhoods, people you don't normally see out in the streets. In the space of just a few weeks, we won two very important local victories. First of all, Councilmember Kshama Sawant, whom I work for and who is a member of Socialist Alternative, led the fight to win a ban on the police use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other so-called crowd control weapons. And secondly, those of us who are union members mobilized to expel the racist police guild out of our labor council. Both were important, tangible wins. And of course, as these wins were progressing, the bigger fight developed over the community demand to defund the bloated Seattle Police Department by 50%. Our police budget is north of $400 million a year, and the police constitute the single largest portion of the city's budget. So with thousands of people marching in the streets, the political establishment was certainly on their back heels. Now, there are 9 city council members in Seattle, 1 Socialist Alternative member, and 8 Democrats. Within weeks, 6 of the 8 Democrats publicly declared their support for defunding the police by 50%. And it was really telling to watch them publicly express their remorse for backing police expansion in the past, for not listening to the community. It was really quite a saga, quite an apology tour by the political establishment. And activists were giddy, with 6 of 8 Democrats and of course Kshama supporting defunding SPD, the Seattle Police Department. They said, we have a veto-proof majority, we've won. And they thought that all they needed to do then was just go cash the check. But we said that's absolutely not the case. We have not won. But I have to tell you that it was impossible to convince many activists that that was the case. Now let's fast forward 4 months. We just finished our city budget fight 2 weeks ago, and we won not a 50% reduction in the police budget, but an 8% reduction. When Kshama put forward budget amendments to defund the police by 50%, it didn't even get a second on the council. The Democrats simply did not even want to debate the issue. Now, what we won is not nothing, 8% reduction, but it's not nearly what the movement demanded of the politicians. So what happened? Well, as you know, power relations are never static. The political establishment, the police, and big business mounted a counterattack as soon as the protests began to ebb. First, they went to court to block the weapons ban. Secondly, big business, using the mouthpiece of right-wing media, talk radio, and so on, began mobilizing against what they called violence and anarchy in the streets, using racist dog whistles to stir up support. And on the streets, police doubled down on their violence, tear gas, batons, rubber bullets, sending many people to the hospital, and even kidnapping a couple of protesters. Now that was the fist, but there was also the velvet glove of the establishment. The mayor and the Democrats on city council drew activists into discussions around reallocating the city budget, and much of the movement energy got co-opted into this insider game. What had been a popular street movement making demands became a lobbying campaign making entreaties. And I have to say, folks, a lot of these folks who got sucked into this were people who would call themselves socialists. Some activists continue marching in the streets, but much of the energy dispersed. The fundamental mistake that activists made was to believe that when Democrats publicly declared their support for defunding the police, they had won, and they could then shift from the outside movement pressure to consolidating their gains through rational discourse with the political establishment. They had a mistaken understanding of the power of power and class dynamics. That is, they didn't have a clear analysis of the coercive role that police play in defending and perpetuating the political and economic structures of the capitalist system. Now, of course, the political establishment never had any intention of agreeing to give up their defense forces. The mayor and Democrats were smart enough to understand they could draw activists out of the street and into negotiations and neutralize the fight back. Now, we've seen the Seattle example mirrored on the national stage, where Democrats engaged in these performative displays to prove how much they love Black Lives Matter, but then go on to denounce any talk of defunding the police. I think it's important in reviewing experiences like these, especially at times when working people are on the defensive on so many fronts, that we have to appreciate why activists get co-opted by the political establishment. And really, it's our job in the coming years to be struggling with activists to understand what's at play and power, what's the importance of power and class in understanding how we fight on any basis. We also have to have the humility to recognize that our job is only partly about convincing people on the strength of our arguments, and more about engaging and educating through active struggles. We have to walk with people through experience, and that means being in the streets with them. Steve, how much more time do I have?
You have 5 minutes and 31 seconds.
Excellent. So I want to just give you a quick example of how people learn through experience. I had a few years ago, I worked with the airport workers at SeaTac Airport. We won the first successful ballot initiative for $15 minimum wage. At one point, we had the workers and clergy march on the headquarters of Alaska Airlines, the big airlines there, to deliver a set of demands. And a friend of mine, Reverend John Helmier, was leading with some workers, and he and the workers come out to the door of the headquarters, and they knock on the door. And this PR guy from the corporation comes out and says, well, the CEO's not available, but, I'll have a couple of clergy and a couple of workers. You can, a small delegation can come in. Now, we had no time to caucus or prepare for this. And Reverend Helmier had to rely on his own instincts. And afterwards, he told me that what he recalled from scripture to come up with a response. He said, it was like the temptation of Christ in the moment. Oh, you can come in and have special access and be treated differently. And Reverend Helmier said, no, we go in together or we don't go in at all. You're not going to split us off. And what he reflected on later was, it was really insightful for him to see the power of being together and how bosses try to split us apart. So people learn through struggle. Now, let me just finish up by talking about a few sites of struggle that we can go further into during the Q&A if you want. These are not an exclusive list, but I think that they're worth identifying here in the outset. First of all, sites of housing is an important site of struggle in the coming period. 30 million renters in the United States are at risk of eviction once the existing eviction moratoriums expire. We are going to see a tsunami of evictions in 2021. And how we engage in these housing fights, how unions and other allied organizations engage, I think is going to be critical. A second site of struggle I want to identify is climate justice. Now, obviously, COVID has stalled out some of the burgeoning movement, the youth-led movement around climate justice, but I think we should expect that to regain momentum in the next year. And especially for those of us on the West Coast, routinely seeing climate fires every year. This brings new urgency to the situation and opportunities for organizing, fight back, and struggle. Third is race. Notwithstanding the short-term setbacks that we've all talked about with the Black Lives Matter movement, the fight really has been building not over the last 6 months, but over the last 6 years. Racism, of course, profound, deeply embedded in every aspect of American life, and it's going to be an important site of struggle over the next few years around racism, around police accountability, and so on. And then fourthly, the precarious economy. We're working right now with a lot of workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, DoorDash workers, and so on, people who are in struggle and are experiencing the capitalist dream of how work should be organized in the 21st century. A lot of the organizing is happening right now, sometimes within traditional unions, a lot of times without. And in particular, the role of immigrant communities is going to be critical in how we fight back against the precarious economy in the years ahead. In closing, one of the questions in announcing this forum asked, what are the challenges and openings for building a base of socialists in the working class and engaging electorally? And I would just answer that briefly, that the challenges are really grounded in the lack of power and class analysis that leads to despair, or if the movement has some success, co-optation and reformism, as we just experienced in the police defunding battle. The openings I think that we have are the work we can do alongside others in struggle to educate, to build consciousness about how the world really works, and to unite in struggle through more militant, strategic, and tactical battles. Anytime we have a fight, I really like to ask two questions. First of all, whether it's a bargaining fight in a union context or a community fight, it's what did we win? And the second question is, what did we build? We may not on a national basis win any big breakthroughs in the next few years, but we do have an opportunity and an obligation to build movements, to build socialist movements, to build organizations that are going to act independently of the political establishment. And I'm very excited about what we have ahead of us. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. That was extremely thoughtful and interesting. Now we have Nicole Aschoff.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm a little bit close to Chris, but not too close. Thanks to Socialist Project and particularly to Herman for inviting me. And I think actually this is a nice sort of mix of voices. And so I think I would just kind of like to talk a little bit today about some things that have been on my mind, and they're not necessarily the kind of direct, granular, strategic questions in terms of how to rebuild the labor movement. And I'd like to just say, in particularly, you know, with Jonathan, and I think I'll be able to circle back to some of his comments about tech in a little bit. But for me, I'd like to think more kind of broadly, and Steve, you raised some really interesting ways of framing it at the beginning of your introductory comments. I'd like to think a little bit more broadly about the crisis of neoliberalism, both at the global level and the national level. You know, if we think back, and it seems hard to remember, but 4 years ago, when Donald Trump was elected, there was this sort of upsurge of gloom and horror and, you know, this kind of panic from centrist elites who discussed the election of Donald Trump and also at the same time Brexit as a kind of breakdown of the kind of third way consensus that had reigned for 4 decades. And there was an expectation of a kind of catastrophic collapse of the kind of neoliberal global world order. So I think it's important, if we're going to understand where we're moving forward, to understand kind of what the situation is globally, to get a grasp of what the potentialities are. And so one of the things that I think I'd like to talk just a little bit about is how much of that kind of panic and fear became a reality under Trump, and where do we see it going with Biden, you know, in the next 4 years, probably just 4 years, probably not 8 years. So I think one of the interesting things that, you know, when we're trying to understand, you know, what's happening globally, I think there's a tendency in the United States in particular to understand all processes through Donald Trump over the past 4 years, and it's easy to lose sight of some of the kind of consistencies and really strong structural, you know, processes that haven't changed that much. So one of the greatest criticisms that the kind of Trumpist worldview kind of put forth, and it was, you know, also supported by people like Steve Bannon and popular right figures around the world, is this idea that globalism, as it became called, was bad for the United States. It was bad for working people everywhere, and it was time for an America First kind of agenda. And we saw this most obviously with the United States and the Trump administration's very direct attack on global governing institutions. It's kind of trying to sabotage the WTO. Also, of course, the World Health Organization pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And in general, this idea, you know, creating a tariff war with China, and this idea that the global status quo was something that needed to be dramatically rebuilt. Well, we did see in some respects, particularly with the tariff war and the increasing kind of geopolitical tension over issues of digital technology and the role of China in actually getting a leap on global digital technology through companies like Huawei, that the United States really started to push its agenda. And we saw some kind of reorganization of global supply chains, right? For the first time in a long time, we're seeing actually companies taking seriously the political implications of a war between the US and China in terms of, you know, the politics of digital technology. And we see some companies like Apple, Google, Dell actually reorganizing their supply chains a bit. Now, does this mean that we're going to see an end of globalization? Certainly in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, when we saw hospital workers unable to get even the most basic PPE, there was another big kind of boost in conversation about the precarity of global supply chains and whether or not it made sense or whether it was necessary for countries, including the United States, to redirect production back to a national level. But we saw that a lot of this has been overstated. The US trade deficit is the highest it's ever been. And we see, rather than companies moving back to the United States, we see a reorganization and a scattering with some movement away from China. How do we think this is going to change with a Biden administration, right? Because one of the reasons why Trump really was popular, particularly amongst a certain sector of the working class, was not just that people are racist and xenophobic, that is partly true, but also that the kind of neoliberal globalization model that has prevailed for 3 decades has been really bad for working people in the United States. So do we see the possibility that Biden will actually, you know, try to resurrect the centrist kind of neoliberal globalization model, or will he actually listen to some of the kind of critiques that working people have of the impact of these kind of free trade agreements on livelihoods? And I think certainly it's an interesting question in the sense that the world has changed from 4 years ago. Partly because we see China becoming much more aggressive in its relationships with other countries. But at the same time, I don't think we should overstate what Biden will actually be willing to accomplish here. And I think one of the interesting things is this question of tariffs, right? And whether Biden will use his executive authority to overturn this. Right now we have about $370 billion worth of tariffs against Chinese goods. Will Biden actually use his executive authority to get rid of steel and aluminum tariffs? He's already said that he's not actually interested in doing that, and that he wants to use this kind of trade war with China as a way to rebuild ties with Europe and to kind of put the US back in a position of leadership. And I think that this question of putting the United States back in a question back in a position, of global leadership is something that the left should be thinking about. And partly because when we think about the last 4 years, the left, I think, has in the United States has kind of fallen into this kind of thought patterns of centrists, of seeing Donald Trump as an anathema, as a kind of perversion, and as someone who is really shaking up the global order. And this has sort of distracted us from the kind of continuities of US global empire and power that I think it's time to kind of refocus on a little bit. So if we're thinking about the crisis of neoliberalism globally, I think it's really important to take stock of the fact that certain things, for example, the United States as a military power who is willing to use that military power to ensure its dominance globally, this has not changed. There was a lot of, kind of talk and chatter about how Trump was thinking about moving troops out of Germany, and Biden was opposed to this. But if we think about the big picture, right, the fact that the United States has 200,000 troops located at roughly 800 military bases worldwide, and we see nothing but an ever-growing military budget. We can call it the defense budget if we want to get Orwellian. And that much of this new funding will be used to fund new weapons production. This is something that the left, in the United States, I think we should take this moment to sort of recenter and refocus and think about these kind of broader issues. Roughly a year ago, the Financial Times was regularly publishing op-eds and articles about whether capitalism would survive, right? And there was sort of a daily stream of commentary about how if the United States and if global capitalism is to survive, we need to actually take stock of these deeper crises, whether it's the need for reconfiguring our energy supplies to deal with climate change, to take stock of extremely wide and ever widening income inequality in the United States, and to actually take seriously the need for people to be able to receive an education without going into debt. All of these kinds of questions have been sort of completely forgotten today when we think about the kind of conversations that we're having about the incoming Biden administration. I used the example of tariffs, but we can think about how Wall Street is praying for a Republican Senate. The old saying, which is popular now, gridlock is Goldilocks, shows you that this moment where capital was seeming to be listening, certainly during the Democratic primaries, listening to the kind of left wing of the Democratic Party in a way that might possibly shape, policies in a more progressive direction down the road, quickly passed. So we see, a Biden administration coming in that is trying to basically resurrect the neoliberal consensus that has been reigning for 4 decades at least. And this to me is very concerning and depressing, and does suggest, not to disagree with Chris, but does suggest the need for a very sober assessment as to how do we actually build power and where the left should be directing its energies. So if we think about, the crisis of neoliberalism globally, my point in talking about, just the US military and US empire was a more specific kind of intervention to say that the left in the United States has very much lost its kind of internationalist kind of lens on the world. I think, with the exception of thinking about the need for a Green New Deal, this question of the US military and the absolute chaos that is, the result of US military interventions globally, I think is something that we need to reconsider and start talking about a bit more. But when we think about, this sort of crisis of neoliberalism in the United States, right? If we think about the crisis as a kind of national crisis, this again really leaves me with a lot more questions than answers. And I think, there was this kind of sense, particularly after 2008, 2009, that people in the United States were so angry and so polarized that much of the sort of crisis of neoliberalism, the breakdown, the kind of creating the groundwork for a progressive upsurge would happen a bit naturally. And I think that we see with the election of Biden and the shaming of the sort of progressive caucus of the Democratic Party, the shaming of socialists, is that this will in no case, in no way be the situation. In the United States, we have this kind of bizarro world where the US stock market is absolutely booming and has become completely unmoored from, Main Street, if we want to call it that. The US government has essentially committed itself to quantitative easing forever. It has said that it will pump money into the stock market for as long as necessary. And the, kind of traditional constraints on business, whether it's, labor costs or the cost of capital, have kind of evaporated. So it creates this really strange situation where one wonders what the limits are to this kind of, chasm of inequality when there's really no appetite, right? Instead, we see a Biden administration who is basically trying to reproduce the Obama administration in not just in its worldview, but also in the actual people that it's hiring to take over these key positions. So where does this leave the left? I'd like to talk just in the time that I have remaining about another area where I think, and I just want to say again, I think the points that Chris made and particularly that Jonathan made are absolutely spot on in the sense that this kind of need for grassroots on the ground struggles to actually do this kind of nitty gritty work, whether it's at the level of the city council or reforming, city police departments and so forth. But I do think that there are some actually really big questions right now that the left shouldn't be afraid to get in there and tackle. One of them was this question of, US weapons development and the expansion of the US military's aggressive role, whether it's through AFRICOM, its drone program, and so forth. But another area that I think that the left should intervene more aggressively and is this question of big tech and the role of technology companies like Amazon, which Jonathan talked about, but also Google and Facebook, and Apple, if we want to talk about Apple too, in kind of shaping the landscape of the United States, both in terms of actual working conditions for ordinary people. Amazon employs roughly 1/4 of all logistics workers in the United States now, but also much bigger questions about how to actually tackle the power of corporations. And as many of you probably know, there is finally in the United States what looks to be the beginning of a kind of antitrust move against tech companies in the United States. The Trump Justice Department has finally taken a few steps to open the question of reinforcing antitrust. In this case of a case against Google, but also the FTC has been investigating Facebook. And I think we're at the beginning of what could be, a potential reckoning for these big tech companies in the United States. And of course, Europe has already taken the lead and are actually, pursuing a much more aggressive policy against these tech companies. But I just think in this moment, right, there was a lot of criticism of tech companies and Facebook and Twitter in particular, and in their role in shaping the election. But I think that tech companies obviously I have a particular interest in US tech companies, but I think that this is actually something that the US left is right now leaving this to the conservatives, right? And they're allowing a very limited kind of understanding of taking on corporate power to be shaping the narrative. And if we think about this call to revive antitrust, I think it's an extreme, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but I think this is actually an area, if we think about the kind of grassroots struggle that Jonathan mentioned, right? If we want to start talking about building a force to actually become a voice for working class people, taking on a company like Amazon could actually create the kind of connections between, actual warehouse workers and small business owners, and actually ordinary people that could be a kind of concrete project. So I think my point in talking about tech here is just to advocate for a kind of intervention from the left into new spheres, right? And to really not be afraid to come up with some big demands, right? On top of grassroots struggles, but to actually try to shape the discourse in a way that isn't just centered around the kind of narrow playground of ideas that we've really been kind of stuck in over the past 4 years. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to talk more about any of these issues in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Nicole, and everybody else. Those were all very thought-provoking and excellent presentations. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And thanks everybody else who joined us on the call as well. And I guess we will see you again sometime soon, I hope, next time under better circumstances and in person.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks everyone. Had a great time.
Thank you, in solidarity.